They told me the hardest part of coming home would be surviving the war. They were wrong. The hardest part was discovering there was no home left to return to. The bus hissed to a stop beneath a gray October sky, its worn tires crunching against loose gravel as Ethan Brooks stepped onto the quiet roadside with nothing but a faded duffel bag slung over his shoulder. After 8 years in the military, the world felt strangely louder and quieter at the same time. The distant hum of pickup trucks on the highway sounded unfamiliar, while the silence between those sounds stretched endlessly, pressing against his thoughts like an empty room. The crisp Midwestern air carried the scent of pine trees and fresh rain instead of fuel and machinery, yet his body refused to relax. Every unfamiliar noise still pulled his attention for a split second before he reminded himself there was nothing to fear anymore. At least that was what everyone kept telling him. Welcome home. Thank you for your service. You'll figure things out. Those words had followed him from the base to the airport, and now to this forgotten little town tucked between rolling hills and endless forests. They were kind words, but kindness alone couldn't answer the question that had haunted him every night since receiving his discharge papers. Who was Ethan Brooks without the uniform? His parents had passed away years earlier, his younger sister had built a family 3 states away, and most of his old friends had slowly become strangers whose lives had continued while his remained frozen somewhere between deployments. The town itself barely recognized him anymore. New storefronts lined Main Street beside buildings he remembered from childhood, while familiar faces had grown older, their smiles polite but uncertain, as though they were trying to place someone from an old photograph. Ethan adjusted the strap on his bag and started walking toward the only property he still owned, a small cabin his grandfather had left behind decades ago. The narrow gravel driveway was overgrown with weeds, and ivy had claimed one side of the porch. A weathered rocking chair rested beside the front door exactly where his grandfather had always left it, gently moving in the autumn breeze as if someone invisible had stood moments earlier. Ethan unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust floated through thin rays of afternoon sunlight, illuminating shelves filled with forgotten tools, faded family pictures, and the familiar scent of cedar wood that instantly carried him back to childhood summers spent building birdhouses with rough but patient hands guiding his own. For the first time in years, his breathing slowed. This place hadn't expected anything from him. It didn't care about medals, rank, or the mistakes he still replayed in quiet moments. It simply waited. Setting his duffel on the worn wooden floor, Ethan opened every window, letting fresh air push away years of stillness. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, a dog barked, followed by the distant laughter of children riding bicycles along the country road. Life had continued without asking for permission. As the sun drifted lower across the hills, Ethan grabbed an old toolbox and stepped onto the porch, determined to repair the loose railing before nightfall. He had no idea that before this day ended, one unexpected stranger with silver-gray eyes would change everything he believed about second chances. I spent the next morning repairing the front porch before the sun had fully climbed above the trees. Every loose board I replaced and every rusty nail I pulled free gave my hands something simple to focus on, something that did not require memories or explanations. The steady rhythm of a hammer striking wood was strangely comforting, almost like breathing. By noon, the old cabin looked a little less forgotten, and for the first time since arriving, I felt as though I belonged somewhere, even if that somewhere was a weathered house hidden at the edge of a quiet forest. Hunger eventually convinced me to walk into town. Main Street was exactly the size I remembered, a handful of family-owned businesses sitting beneath colorful awnings that had faded beneath decades of changing seasons. The diner still displayed homemade pies behind the glass counter, the hardware store smelled of fresh lumber, and children laughed as they chased one another across the small park beside the courthouse. It was ordinary in every possible way, and somehow that ordinary life felt extraordinary after years spent moving from one assignment to another. As I stepped inside the local grocery store with nothing more ambitious than buying bread, eggs, and coffee, a loud crash echoed near the front entrance. A display of canned soup had collapsed across the polished floor after an elderly customer accidentally bumped into one of the shelves with his shopping cart. Several people froze for a moment, uncertain what to do, Instinct moved faster than thought. I crossed the aisle, steadied the frightened man before he could lose his balance, and knelt beside him to gather the scattered cans. He smiled with embarrassed gratitude while insisting he was perfectly fine. Together we stacked the remaining cans back into a neat pile until an employee hurried over, thanking us both with obvious relief. As I stood, brushing dust from my jeans, I became aware of someone watching from across the store. He stood near the front windows, tall enough to rise above the crowd without trying. His charcoal coat looked expensive without appearing flashy, perfectly tailored over broad shoulders that carried quiet confidence instead of arrogance. Silver-gray eyes met mine for only a heartbeat, calm and unreadable, yet something about that brief glance unsettled me. It was not fear. It was recognition without memory, the strange feeling that I had crossed paths with someone important long before I knew why. He gave a polite nod, almost imperceptible, before turning toward the cashier with a basket containing nothing more than black coffee beans and a loaf of artisan bread. There were no bodyguards, no loud conversations, no attempt to attract attention, but people naturally stepped aside as he walked past them, offering respectful greetings that he answered with quiet sincerity. An older cashier smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." He returned the smile with equal kindness before paying and leaving without another word. I watched the glass door close behind him, unsure why my eyes continued following a complete stranger. "You must be new around here," the cashier said as she scanned my groceries. That was Mason Carter. Owns half the businesses in the county, but you would never know it by the way he acts. I nodded politely, pretending the name meant nothing, though it lingered in my thoughts all the way back to the cabin. Late that afternoon, while organizing old tools inside the workshop behind the house, I noticed fresh tire tracks leading along the gravel road beyond my property. They had not been there that morning. I stepped outside just in time to glimpse a dark SUV disappearing between the towering pines before it vanished around the bend, leaving only silence and the growing feeling that my quiet new beginning might not remain quiet for very long. The following morning began with an unexpected knock on the cabin door just as I finished sanding the frame of an old workbench that had belonged to my grandfather. The sound echoed through the quiet house, surprising me because almost nobody knew I had returned except a few people in town. Wiping the sawdust from my hands, I opened the door to find a middle-aged man wearing a denim jacket embroidered with the logo of Carter Development. His smile was friendly, carrying none of the stiffness I had expected from someone representing a large company. "You are Ethan Brooks, correct?" he asked. I nodded cautiously. "My name is Daniel Harris. Mr. Carter heard you recently came back to town. We have been restoring several historic properties nearby, and someone mentioned you have experience with construction and engineering from your military service. We could use someone with your skills if you are interested." The offer caught me completely off guard. I had expected to spend weeks searching for work, not have it arrive at my front porch. "I appreciate it," I replied honestly, "but I have only been back for a few days. I still have plenty to figure out." Daniel handed me a simple business card. "No pressure. Think about it. Mr. Carter believes people deserve time to settle before making big decisions." After he left, I stood on the porch turning the card over in my hand. There was no elaborate corporate slogan, only a name, a phone number, and a small silver emblem shaped like an oak tree. It felt surprisingly personal. Later that afternoon, curiosity finally convinced me to drive into town. Carter Development occupied a beautifully restored brick building overlooking the town square. Instead of towering glass walls or expensive marble floors, the lobby displayed local artwork, photographs of community projects, and shelves filled with books about regional history. Employees greeted one another by name, laughing easily as they crossed the hallways. It was nothing like the cold corporate offices I had imagined. While waiting near the reception desk, I wandered toward a large window overlooking the construction site behind the building. Workers carefully restored an abandoned library rather than replacing it with something modern. The project seemed less about profit and more about preserving memories. "Beautiful, is it not?" a familiar voice said beside me. I turned to find Mason Carter standing only a few feet away. Up close, He appeared even calmer than I remembered, his silver-gray eyes reflecting quiet intelligence rather than authority. He extended his hand without hesitation. "I do not believe we have properly met. I am Mason Carter." His handshake was firm but respectful. "Ethan Brooks. I remember seeing you help that gentleman at the grocery store," he said. "Most people stopped to watch. You simply acted." I shrugged awkwardly. "Anyone would have done the same." A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "You would be surprised." For several seconds neither of us spoke. There was no uncomfortable silence, only an unexpected sense of ease that settled between us. Mason finally gestured toward the library outside the window. "My grandfather taught me that towns survive because ordinary people choose to care about them every single day. Buildings matter less than the people inside them." His words reminded me of my own grandfather so strongly that I found myself smiling without realizing it. Before I could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced briefly at the screen, his expression becoming thoughtful. "Duty has terrible timing," he said with quiet humor. "I hope we have another chance to talk soon." As he walked away, I noticed something resting on the nearby conference table. It was an old military challenge coin engraved with the insignia of my former unit. I picked it up instinctively, my pulse quickening. That coin should not have been here. Very few people outside my unit had ever seen one, and somehow Mason Carter already possessed it. The small silver coin felt unexpectedly heavy in my palm, its worn edges polished smooth by years of careful handling. I traced the engraved insignia with my thumb, unable to understand how it had found its way onto a conference table inside Mason Carter's office. Fewer than 100 people had ever received one like it, and every coin had been presented personally at the end of a specialized mission that officially did not exist. I looked toward the hallway where Mason had disappeared, wondering if I should follow him, but something held me back. Instead, I slipped the coin into my jacket pocket and quietly left the building, telling myself there had to be a simple explanation. The drive back to the cabin should have taken 15 minutes, yet I barely remembered the road. Questions circled endlessly through my mind. Had Mason served before building his company? Had he known someone from my unit? Or was this nothing more than an impossible coincidence that my tired brain refused to let go? That evening I climbed into the attic searching for old family photographs, hoping the familiar faces might distract me. Dust covered every box stored beneath the slanted roof, and the faint scent of cedar mixed with dry autumn air drifting through a cracked window. Most of the boxes contained holiday decorations, worn blankets, and handwritten letters from relatives long gone. Then I found an old leather album tucked beneath a faded quilt. Sitting cross-legged on the wooden floor, I slowly turned each page. There were birthday parties, fishing trips with my grandfather, county fairs, and school baseball games. Halfway through the album, a loose photograph slipped free and landed beside my knee. I picked it up without thinking. The picture showed my grandfather standing outside this very cabin, nearly 20 years earlier, beside another man I had never seen before. Between them stood two boys around 10 years old. One of them was unmistakably me, smiling with dirt on my jeans and a fishing pole balanced across my shoulder. The other boy stared directly into the camera with calm silver-gray eyes and dark hair brushed neatly away from his face. My breath caught. Even as a child, there was no mistaking him. It was Mason. I turned the photograph over. In my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting were only 6 words. Summer at Cedar Creek. Ethan and Mason. Best friends forever. The words felt unreal. I searched my memory desperately, but there was nothing. No image. No voice. No childhood adventures. It was as though those summers had been erased from my life entirely. Before I could think any further, headlights swept across the cabin windows. A vehicle had stopped outside. Looking through the curtain, I recognized the same dark sport utility vehicle I had glimpsed the previous afternoon. This time it did not drive away. After a moment, someone stepped out carrying a small cardboard box. It was Mason. He approached the porch alone, his expression thoughtful rather than serious. When I opened the door, he offered the box with an almost apologetic smile. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Inside rested several weathered woodworking tools engraved with my grandfather's initials. "The Historical Society stored them years ago during a property survey," Mason explained. "I thought they deserved to come home." I looked from the tools to the photographs still resting in my other hand. Mason's eyes settled on the picture, and for the first time since we met, genuine emotion crossed his face. It was quiet, almost wistful. "You found it," he said softly. "I wondered how long it would take." I stared at him in complete confusion. Why do I not remember any of this? Mason held my gaze for several silent seconds before answering with a sadness that seemed far older than either of us. "Because someone made certain that you never would." The words lingered between us long after the evening breeze had settled into complete stillness. I searched Mason's face for any sign that this was some kind of misunderstanding, but all I found was quiet patience, as though he had carried this conversation in his mind for years. "I do not understand," I finally admitted. "No one can simply erase an entire friendship." Mason glanced toward the old rocking chair on the porch before taking a slow seat, inviting me to join him without saying a word. I lowered myself onto the step across from him, the photograph still resting in my hands. "Your grandfather asked me to promise something," Mason began softly. "If the day ever came when you remembered this place, I was supposed to tell you the truth only when you were ready to hear it. Not before." I frowned. Why would he ask that? Mason folded his hands together, choosing each word carefully. "Because after your parents passed away, everything changed very quickly. You blamed this town for every painful memory you carried. Your grandfather believed the only way you could move forward was by starting somewhere completely new. He wanted you to build your own future instead of remaining trapped by the past." I looked down at the faded photograph again. The two boys smiling beside the creek looked completely carefree. It was difficult to imagine that one of them had eventually walked away without ever looking back. "So we really were friends?" I asked quietly. Mason smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. "Not just friends. Every summer you insisted we build something together. Tree houses that could barely stand, wooden boats that never floated, bird feeders that squirrels always emptied before the birds arrived. Your grandfather used to laugh because we spent more time making plans than finishing projects." Despite everything, I found myself smiling. Strange flashes drifted through my thoughts. The scent of fresh cut cedar. Sunlight reflecting across moving water. The distant sound of laughter that felt familiar without revealing a face. They disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived, leaving only a faint warmth behind. "Maybe I remember a little," I whispered. Mason nodded without surprise. "Memories rarely disappear forever. Sometimes they simply wait for something familiar to invite them home." Over the following week, an unexpected routine quietly formed between us. Every morning I worked on restoring the cabin or clearing the neglected workshop behind it. By afternoon, Mason often stopped by after visiting one of his construction sites. Sometimes he brought blueprints for the historic library restoration. Other times he carried nothing more than 2 cups of fresh coffee from the diner downtown. We talked about woodworking, local history, favorite baseball teams, and the changing seasons. He never pushed me to remember anything I had forgotten. Instead, he seemed content creating new memories while allowing the old ones to return at their own pace. The workshop slowly came alive again as we repaired antique furniture donated by neighbors who preferred restoration over replacement. Working side by side felt surprisingly natural, as though years apart had somehow folded into a single quiet afternoon. The townspeople noticed it too. They greeted us with warm smiles, occasionally sharing stories about our childhood adventures that neither of us interrupted, even when I could not remember them myself. Then one rainy evening, while sorting through a stack of old property records that Mason had borrowed from the Historical Society, a folded envelope slipped onto the workbench. Across the front, written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, were 2 names side by side. Ethan Brooks. Mason Carter. Beneath them appeared a single sentence that made both of us fall silent. If you are reading this together, the time has finally come for you to learn what really happened at Cedar Creek. For several long seconds, neither of us reached for the envelope. It rested on the workbench beneath the warm glow of a single hanging light, looking ordinary despite the weight it suddenly carried. The paper had yellowed with age, and the familiar handwriting across the front seemed almost alive, as though my grandfather had expected this exact moment years before it finally arrived. Mason slowly picked it up, turning it over to reveal an old wax seal that had somehow remained unbroken. He always said some stories should wait until the people inside them were ready, Mason said quietly. I nodded, unable to take my eyes off the envelope. Then maybe we are finally ready. Mason carefully opened the seal and unfolded several neatly written pages. His eyes moved across the first lines before he paused and handed the letter to me. I think you should read it. My hands trembled slightly as I began. My dear Ethan and Mason, if these words have found both of you together again, then life has been kinder than I dared to hope. There are truths I kept from you, not because they were shameful, but because I believed they would become meaningful only after you had grown into the men you were meant to become. I continued reading in silence while the workshop seemed to disappear around us. My grandfather described two boys who had spent every free afternoon exploring Cedar Creek, building impossible inventions from scrap wood, and promising that one day they would restore the old town together. He wrote about our endless curiosity, our friendly competitions, and our shared belief that broken things deserved another chance before being thrown away. Every page painted a childhood I could not remember but somehow recognized deep inside myself. Then the letter changed. Years ago, after my parents passed away, I had become withdrawn and determined to leave town as soon as I was old enough. According to my grandfather, I had insisted that staying would only keep every painful memory alive. Mason, still just a teenager, had argued with me for hours, trying to convince me that running away would not erase grief. In the end, my grandfather had quietly supported my decision, believing distance might help me heal. Before I left, he had asked Mason to make one promise. Do not come looking for Ethan until he chooses to come home on his own. Let his future belong to him, not to his past. I lowered the letter, struggling to absorb what I had read. You knew where I was all those years? I asked. Mason nodded. Your grandfather sent me one letter every Christmas. He never told me details about your life. Only that you were safe and that I had to keep my promise. You never tried to contact me? More times than I can count, he admitted with a gentle smile. But every time I started writing, I remembered my promise. I believed one day you would find your own way back. A long silence settled between us, but it no longer felt uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like years of unanswered questions slowly finding their place. I looked around the workshop filled with restored furniture, familiar tools, and fresh sawdust. Suddenly everything made sense. Mason had not appeared in my life by accident. He had been protecting a promise for nearly 2 decades. As I carefully folded the letter, another sheet slipped from between its pages and drifted onto the workbench. Unlike the handwritten letter, this page was a faded map of Cedar Creek with one location circled in red ink. Beneath it, my grandfather had written a single sentence that immediately changed the meaning of everything we thought we understood. The box you buried together is still waiting beneath the old oak tree. The following morning, the sky over Cedar Creek was bright and clear, as though the town itself had been waiting for us to follow the map. Mason packed a small shovel, a thermos of fresh coffee, and the faded letter while I carried the photograph and the old challenge coin that still refused to leave my pocket. The walk to the creek took less than 20 minutes, winding through familiar trails that somehow felt both completely new and strangely familiar. Every few steps another fragment surfaced inside my mind. A crooked bridge built from fallen branches. A rope swing hanging above the water. 2 boys laughing because one of their homemade boats had immediately drifted in circles instead of crossing the creek. The memories were still incomplete, but they no longer felt distant. They felt as though they had simply been waiting for me to notice them again. When we reached the enormous oak tree marked on the map, Mason stopped without hesitation. It has grown a lot, he said with a quiet smile. I looked up through its wide branches stretching across the morning sky. So have we. Using the landmarks sketched on the map, we counted 12 steps from the creek bank before stopping beside a cluster of smooth stones. Mason pushed the shovel into the soft earth while I carefully brushed away layers of fallen leaves. After several minutes, the metal blade struck something solid with a dull sound. We knelt together and uncovered a small weatherproof wooden box wrapped inside a faded canvas cloth. Time had darkened the wood, but the carved initials on the lid remained perfectly clear. E&M. I gently lifted the box from the ground, surprised by how light it felt. For a long moment neither of us opened it. Instead we simply looked at one another, smiling in disbelief that something two children had hidden decades earlier had survived untouched beneath this tree. Finally I released the rusted clasp. Inside rested dozens of small treasures that would have seemed ordinary to anyone else. A smooth skipping stone. 2 handmade wooden whistles. Several photographs. A collection of handwritten notes, folded into tiny squares. A baseball card with worn corners. A compass that no longer pointed north. Beneath them all rested a notebook covered in childish handwriting. Across the front someone had written, "The Cedar Creek Builders Club." I laughed before I could stop myself. We actually named ourselves. Mason chuckled softly. You insisted every important organization needed an official name. I opened the notebook and discovered page after page of ambitious plans drawn in colored pencil. Build a bigger tree house. Restore the abandoned library. Help every elderly neighbor repair something for free. Plant new oak trees every spring. At the very end appeared one final promise written in 2 different handwritings. No matter where life takes us, we will always come back and build something good together. As I read the words aloud, another memory finally returned with startling clarity. I remembered standing beneath this very tree, shaking Mason's hand with complete confidence that our promise would last forever. Emotion caught in my throat as I looked toward him. I remember, I whispered. Not everything. But I remember making this promise. Mason's expression softened with unmistakable relief. Then your grandfather was right. Home did not disappear. It was simply waiting. As we carefully placed every item back into the box except the notebook, I noticed one final object hidden beneath the false bottom of the case. It was a modern key attached to a small brass tag engraved with a single address on the edge of town. Neither of us recognized the location, but tucked beside the key was a short note in my grandfather's handwriting. Your greatest project has never been buried beneath this tree. It has been waiting behind this door. The address on the brass tag led us to the eastern edge of town where an aging brick building stood quietly beneath towering maple trees. Time had faded the white paint above the entrance until only a few letters remained visible, but I could still make out enough to recognize what it had once been. It was the old community workshop my grandfather had often talked about, the place where neighbors gathered to repair furniture, teach woodworking, and help one another long before newer stores replaced small local businesses. The windows were dusty, yet none of them were broken. It looked less abandoned than patiently asleep. My hand tightened around the old key as I stepped toward the front door. The lock resisted for only a second before turning with a soft click. Warm afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, revealing rows of sturdy workbenches, shelves lined with carefully organized tools, and stacks of lumber that had been protected beneath canvas covers. Someone had maintained this place with remarkable care. I walked slowly through the workshop, running my fingers across polished oak tables that carried the marks of countless projects completed over decades. On the far wall hung dozens of framed photographs showing volunteers rebuilding porches, repairing playground equipment, and restoring historic homes throughout the county. In nearly every picture stood my grandfather, smiling beside neighbors whose names I recognized from childhood. Mason quietly joined me before another photograph. It showed 2 young boys proudly holding a crooked wooden birdhouse between them. Even though I had forgotten the day it was taken, I immediately recognized the excitement on our faces. This was our first project, Mason said with a gentle laugh. The roof leaked every time it rained. I smiled. But we refused to admit it. More memories arrived, Not all at once, but like sunlight slowly filling a room. I remembered arguing over paint colors, laughing whenever a board was cut too short, and listening to my grandfather repeat the same lesson every Saturday morning. Strong buildings begin with patient hands. The words echoed so clearly inside my mind that I could almost hear his voice. As we continued exploring, we discovered a large blueprint spread across the central table beneath a protective sheet of glass. The drawing matched the building around us almost perfectly, except for one detail. Across the top someone had written Community Restoration Center, future home of the Cedar Creek builders. Beneath the title appeared two names listed as directors: Ethan Brooks, Mason Carter. I looked toward Mason in disbelief. He planned this before either of us left town. Mason nodded slowly. He believed we would come back one day, even if it took years. Before either of us spoke again, the front door opened behind us. Several familiar townspeople stepped inside carrying paint samples, toolboxes, and trays of homemade cookies. Daniel Harris smiled as though he had been expecting this moment all along. "Your grandfather never stopped believing," he said warmly. "Every year he reminded us to keep this place ready because someday the two boys who dreamed of rebuilding Cedar Creek together would finally come home." I stood speechless as more neighbors entered the workshop, each sharing stories of promises my grandfather had quietly entrusted to them over the years. Looking around the room filled with welcoming faces, I realized I had spent years believing I returned to an empty town searching for a new beginning. Instead, I had unknowingly walked back into a future that had been lovingly protected for me all along, and for the first time in many years, the idea of staying no longer felt like a difficult decision. It felt exactly like where my life had always been meant to continue. 6 months passed more quickly than I ever imagined possible. Spring slowly transformed Cedar Creek, covering the hills with fresh green leaves while the old community workshop filled each morning with the sound of neighbors building, repairing, and learning together. What had once been an abandoned building became the heart of the town again. Retired carpenters taught teenagers how to shape wood with patience instead of haste. Veterans gathered every Saturday to restore furniture that local families could not afford to replace. Children proudly carried home birdhouses, bookshelves, and toy chests they had built with their own hands. Every completed project reminded me that healing rarely arrived all at once. More often, it came one careful step, one shared conversation, and one small act of kindness at a time. Mason and I settled naturally into the roles my grandfather had imagined long before either of us understood his vision. Mason managed community partnerships and organized restoration projects throughout the county, while I spent my days inside the workshop teaching practical skills and helping people discover confidence through creating something with their own hands. We rarely needed many words between us anymore. Years of separation had quietly given way to a friendship strengthened not by the past alone, but by everything we continued building together in the present. One warm Saturday afternoon, the restored library officially reopened. Families filled the front lawn with picnic blankets while musicians from the local high school performed beneath colorful banners stretching across Main Street. Looking around at the smiling faces, I recognized nearly everyone by name. Not long ago I believed I had returned to a town that had forgotten me. Now I realized the truth had always been the opposite. They had simply been waiting for me to remember that I belonged here too. As the celebration continued, Daniel Harris approached carrying a small wooden box wrapped in blue ribbon. "Your grandfather left one final gift," he said. Inside rested the old challenge coin beside a handwritten note. I unfolded the paper carefully. "My dear Ethan, medals honor what you accomplished. This coin reminds you who you became. Never measure your life by the battles you survived. Measure it by the lives you help rebuild after they are over." I read the words twice before quietly placing the note back inside the box. Without realizing it, I slipped the challenge coin into a display case near the workshop entrance where every visitor could see it. It no longer represented a chapter one wanted to carry alone. It became a reminder that every person who walked through those doors had overcome something unseen and deserved the opportunity to begin again. As evening settled across Cedar Creek, Mason and I stood outside the workshop watching families walk home beneath the golden light of sunset. The old rocking chair from my grandfather's porch now rested beside the entrance, welcoming anyone who needed a place to sit, talk, or simply enjoy the quiet. Mason smiled toward the children laughing in the distance before looking at me. Do you think your grandfather knew all of this would happen? I looked around at the restored buildings, the open workshop, and the community we had rebuilt together. Then I remembered the promise two boys had written inside a simple notebook beneath an old oak tree so many years before. I smiled and answered with complete certainty. I think he knew that home is never just a place. It is the people who refuse to give up on one another. The evening breeze gently stirred the oak trees surrounding the workshop, carrying the familiar scent of cedar through the air. For the first time in many years, I no longer wondered where I belonged or what came next. The answer had been waiting patiently all along, not hidden inside old letters or forgotten memories, but in every hand extended with kindness, every promise faithfully kept, and every new beginning built together one piece at a time.